I was 22 years old when my Uncle Dane looked me dead in the eye during Sunday dinner and said, "You weren't adopted, Sage. You were bought." The sound of my fork hitting the plate echoed through the silence that followed, and in that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life shattered like glass. Let me back up for a second and tell you about the people sitting around that dinner table, because understanding them is crucial to understanding how this one sentence changed everything. There was my mom, Coral, who worked night shifts as a nurse and still managed to make these Sunday dinners happen every single week. She's the kind of woman who remembers everyone's favorite foods and keeps Band-Aids in her purse for strangers' kids. My dad, Finn, sat across from her, a man of few words who built houses with his hands and never missed one of my art shows, even when I was terrible at art. Then there was Grandma Ruby, my mom's mother, who had been unusually quiet for weeks. Normally, she'd be telling stories about her bridge club or complaining about her neighbor's loud dog, but lately, she'd just sit there watching everyone with this worried expression I couldn't figure out. And finally, there was Uncle Dane, Mom's younger brother who showed up late to everything and had this habit of saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. I had been so excited to share my news about getting accepted for a design internship in New York. I'd worked for 3 years to get this opportunity, and I thought this dinner would be a celebration. I was mid-sentence, talking about how I'd finally get to work with real clients, when Dane walked in smelling like beer and defeat. That's when he dropped the bomb that would split my world in two. "You weren't adopted, Sage. You were bought." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I watched my mother's face drain of all color while my father's hands clenched into fists on the table. What happened next would force me to question everything I'd ever believed about my family, my identity, and the very foundation of who I thought I was. Because sometimes the people you trust most are the ones keeping the biggest secrets, and sometimes those secrets have been living just 2 streets away, waiting for the right moment to destroy everything you thought you knew about love, family, and the price people are willing to pay for both. Growing up in Maplewood, Ohio, I always thought I had the most ordinary family in the world. We lived in a 2-story house with blue shutters on Elm Street, where every lawn looked the same, and every family seemed to follow the same routine. Dad left for the construction site at 6 in the morning. Mom worked her nursing shifts at the hospital, and I spent my afternoons sketching in my room or working on art projects that covered every surface of our dining room table. But there were always these little things that didn't quite add up, like puzzle pieces that almost fit but left tiny gaps around the edges. I never had baby pictures until I was about 2 years old, and when I asked about it, Mom would get this distant look and say something about losing photos in a move. When kids at school talked about looking like their parents, I'd stare in the mirror trying to find some resemblance between my olive skin and dark curly hair, and my parents' fair complexions and straight brown hair. Mom would always say I got my looks from some distant relative, but she could never quite remember which one. The questions started early, but they were always brushed aside with gentle redirections. Why didn't we have any relatives on Dad's side? Why did Mom get nervous whenever adoption came up on TV shows? Why did she change the subject every time I asked about the hospital where I was born? I learned not to push too hard because it seemed to cause my parents genuine distress, and I loved them too much to keep hurting them with questions they clearly couldn't or wouldn't answer. Instead, I threw myself into art. While other kids played sports or joined clubs, I spent hours drawing, painting, and later designing graphics on my computer. My parents supported this completely, even though it was expensive and they worked blue-collar jobs that required stretching every dollar. Dad would drive an hour to art supply stores to find the exact paints I needed, and Mom would stay up late helping me mount my projects for school exhibitions. They never made me feel like my dreams were impractical or unrealistic. The Sunday dinners at Grandma Ruby's house started when I was 12. Mom insisted that family was the most important thing in the world, and she wanted to make sure we all stayed connected. Ruby lived in a small ranch house about 15 minutes away, and every week she'd make this enormous spread of food that could feed twice as many people as actually showed up. It was always the same group: Mom, Dad, me, Ruby, and Uncle Dane, when he remembered to come. Ruby was my favorite person in the world. She taught me how to braid friendship bracelets, let me help her tend her vegetable garden, and never talked down to me like some adults did. She had this way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most important thing she'd ever heard. But lately, something had changed. She'd gotten quiet and seemed distracted, like she was carrying some heavy weight that she couldn't put down. The shift started about 3 months ago, right around the time I got serious about applying for internships. I'd been working toward this design program in New York since my sophomore year of college, building my portfolio and networking with professionals in the field. When I finally got the acceptance email, I was so excited I could barely contain myself. This was my chance to work with real clients, to see if I had what it took to make it in the design world, and to prove that all those years of my parents' support hadn't been wasted. I planned to announce it at that Sunday's dinner, but when I arrived at Ruby's house, the atmosphere felt different. Mom seemed on edge, checking her phone constantly and jumping every time a car drove by. Ruby kept glancing toward the door like she was expecting bad news to walk through it. Even Dad, who was usually the steady, calm presence in our family, seemed tense and distracted. We were halfway through dinner, and I was building up the courage to share my news when Uncle Dane finally showed up. He'd been drinking, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different about his mood that night. He looked angry and reckless in a way that made everyone at the table shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Mom immediately started trying to manage the situation, offering him food and asking about his job, but Dane brushed off her attempts at normalcy. I decided to share my good news anyway, hoping it might lighten the mood. I told them about the internship, about moving to New York, about finally getting the chance to see if I could make it as a professional designer. For a moment, everyone seemed genuinely happy for me. Ruby smiled for the first time in weeks, and Dad reached over to squeeze my hand. That's when Dane opened his mouth and changed everything forever. The moment I finished telling everyone about my internship acceptance, Uncle Dane let out this bitter laugh that made my stomach drop. He took a long swig from the beer bottle he'd brought with him and shook his head like he'd just heard the world's most ridiculous joke. "Well, I guess all that money Coral spent buying you was worth it after all," he muttered, not quite looking at anyone but speaking loud enough for the whole table to hear. The words hit the air like a slap. I felt my smile freeze on my face as I tried to process what he'd just said. "What do you mean?" "Buying me?" I asked, forcing a laugh because surely this was just Dane being Dane, saying something inappropriate that would make sense once someone explained the context, but the reaction around the table told me this wasn't a joke. Mom's fork clattered to her plate, and she went completely white. Dad's entire body tensed, like he was preparing for a fight. Ruby pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "Oh no, Dane. What have you done?" "Dane, stop talking right now," Mom said, her voice sharp with panic. But there was something in her tone that confirmed my worst fear. She wasn't confused by what he'd said. She was terrified that he'd said it. Dane looked around the table, and I watched the alcohol-fueled anger in his eyes shift to something that looked almost like realization. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "What, she's 22 years old, Coral. Don't you think she has a right to know the truth about how she ended up in this family?" "What truth?" I demanded, my voice coming out higher than I intended. "What are you talking about?" Dad stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor with a sound that made everyone flinch. "Dane, I'm warning you. Stop talking right now or I'll make you stop." But Dane wasn't backing down. Years of resentment seemed to be pouring out of him, and he turned to look directly at me. "You want to know why you don't look like your parents, Sage? Why there are no baby pictures? Why your mother gets weird whenever anyone mentions adoption?" "Dane, please," Ruby begged, but he ignored her. "You weren't adopted through an agency like a normal family would do. Your parents bought you. They paid some desperate woman $15,000 in cash and took you when you were a baby. That's how you became part of this family." The room exploded. Mom started crying, not the gentle tears of someone who's touched by emotion, but the desperate sobbing of someone whose worst nightmare is coming true. Dad moved toward Dane, and for a moment I thought he was actually going to hit him. Ruby was saying something, but I couldn't hear her over the roaring in my ears. "Is that true?" I asked, looking directly at Mom. My voice sounded strange, like it was coming from someone else. Did you buy me? Mom couldn't even look at me. She sat there crying into her hands while Dad stood frozen between wanting to comfort her and wanting to throttle his brother-in-law. The silence stretched on, and with each passing second, I felt pieces of my identity crumbling away. Answer me, I said, louder this time. Did you buy me like I was some kind of object you could purchase? That's when Dad finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Coral, you need to tell her the truth, right now, because if you don't, I will. The look that passed between my parents in that moment was loaded with 20 years of secrets and fear. Mom shook her head frantically, but Dad's expression was resolute. She's not a little girl anymore, Coral. She's an adult, and she deserves to know who she really is and where she came from. Know what? I shouted, standing up from the table. What don't I know? What have you been hiding from me my entire life? The weight of all those little inconsistencies, all those deflected questions, all those times I'd felt like something was just slightly off about my place in this family, came crashing down on me. I realized that every person sitting at this table knew something about me that I didn't know about myself. They'd all been part of some elaborate lie that had shaped my entire existence. I want the truth, I said, my voice shaking. All of it. Right now. And if you don't tell me, I swear I'll walk out of here and never come back. The threat hung in the air like a challenge. I could see the moment when Dad made his decision, when he chose my right to know over my mother's desperate need to keep the secret buried. He looked at me with eyes full of love and regret, and I knew that whatever he was about to tell me would change everything forever. The silence that followed my ultimatum felt like it lasted forever. I could see the war playing out on Dad's face as he looked between me and Mom, weighing 22 years of secrets against his daughter's right to know the truth. Mom was still crying, but now she was looking at him with pure desperation, silently begging him not to destroy the life we'd all built together. Finn, please don't do this, she whispered. She's happy. We're happy. Why does she need to know about all the ugly details? But Dad's jaw was set in that stubborn way I recognized from every time he'd had to make a difficult decision. He pulled out the chair next to me and sat down heavily, like the weight of what he was about to say was physically crushing him. Because she's not a child anymore, Coral, he said quietly. Because she has a right to know where she came from, and because keeping this secret is killing all of us. He turned to face me directly, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. It wasn't just love or protectiveness. It was guilt, deep and raw and painful. Your mother is right about one thing, Sage. What we did wasn't exactly legal. We didn't go through official adoption channels because we couldn't afford to wait 3 years and pay $30,000 in fees. We were desperate to have a child, and when we found out about your birth mother's situation, we thought we were helping everyone involved. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. What situation? Who is my birth mother? Dad ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make 1,000 times when he was trying to figure out how to fix something that seemed unfixable. Her name is Brielle. She was 19 when she had you, living in our apartment complex with an abusive boyfriend who dealt drugs. She was struggling with addiction herself, barely had enough money for food, and she was terrified about what would happen to you if she tried to raise you in that environment. The picture he was painting felt surreal, like he was talking about characters in a movie rather than the circumstances of my birth. So you just took me? You just paid her money and walked away with a baby? It wasn't that simple, Dad said, his voice getting stronger as he committed to telling the whole story. We'd been trying to have children for 8 years. We'd spent our savings on fertility treatments that didn't work. We'd applied for adoption through 3 different agencies, but the waiting lists were endless, and we kept getting rejected because we didn't make enough money or our house wasn't big enough, or some other bureaucratic reason. Mom had stopped crying and was now listening to Dad tell our story like it was the first time she was hearing it too. Maybe it was the first time they'd ever talked about it out loud, even to each other. When we met Brielle, she was 6 months pregnant and living on our floor of the apartment building. Your mother started talking to her, bringing her groceries, trying to help however she could. That's when Brielle told us she was planning to give you up for adoption but couldn't afford the legal fees to do it properly. I felt sick to my stomach. So you saw an opportunity and took advantage of a desperate teenager? No, Dad said firmly. We saw a way to help a young woman who wanted to give her baby a better life, and we saw a chance to finally become the parents we'd always dreamed of being. We paid for all of Brielle's medical expenses during her pregnancy. We made sure she had proper nutrition and prenatal care. We found her a place to stay that was safe from her boyfriend. The room felt like it was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about my origins, about my parents' character, about the foundation of our family, was being rewritten in real time. The $15,000 wasn't payment for you, Sage, Dad continued. It was money to help Brielle get clean, get her own apartment, and start over somewhere safe. We stayed in touch with her for the first year after you came to live with us. We sent her pictures and updates because she wanted to know you were okay. What happened after that first year? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dad looked at Mom, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to continue. She relapsed. She disappeared for about 3 years, and we lost contact completely. We didn't know if she was alive or dead, and we were terrified that someday child services would show up and take you away from us. The weight of their fear, carried for over 20 years, suddenly made sense of so many things. Mom's overprotectiveness, Dad's reluctance to put my name on any official documents until absolutely necessary, their hesitation about family photos and medical records. That's not all, is it? I asked, seeing something else in their faces. There's more you're not telling me. Dad's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. There was more to this story, something bigger than what they'd already revealed. I looked around the table and noticed that Grandma Ruby had gone completely still, her hands folded tightly in her lap like she was trying to hold something inside. Ruby, I said, turning to face her directly. You know something, don't you? You've been acting strange for months, and now I know why. What aren't they telling me? Ruby's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Mom with an expression that seemed to be asking for forgiveness. I can't keep this secret anymore, Coral. It's been eating me alive, and she deserves to know. Know what? I demanded, my voice rising with frustration and fear. Ruby took a shaky breath and looked directly at me. Brielle didn't disappear forever, sweetheart. She's been living 2 streets over from me for the past 5 years. She's been clean for 7 years now, has a steady job at the library, and she asks about you every single time I see her at the grocery store. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. She's here? She's been here this whole time? She moved to town about 5 years ago, Ruby continued, her voice breaking. She didn't know we lived here. It was just a coincidence. She got a job at the main branch library and rented a little house on Maple Avenue. I recognized her immediately, even though she looked so different, so much healthier. I couldn't process what I was hearing. My biological mother, the woman I'd been told had vanished into addiction and chaos, was living 2 miles away from where I grew up. Does she know I'm here? Does she know where I am? Ruby nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I told her the first time I saw her I couldn't help myself. She broke down crying right there in the cereal aisle. She said she'd been praying for 20 years that you were safe and happy, that she'd made the right choice. Mom was shaking her head frantically. Ruby, you promised you wouldn't say anything. You promised you'd let us handle this our way. What way, Coral? Ruby shot back with more fire than I'd ever heard from her. You've had 5 years to tell Sage the truth, and instead you've been pretending this woman doesn't exist. I turned to stare at my parents, fury building in my chest. You knew? You knew she was alive and living nearby, and you never told me? Dad's face was gray with shame. We were terrified, Sage. Terrified that if you knew she was clean and stable, you'd want to leave us for her. Terrified that you'd hate us for taking you away from her in the first place. She never tried to contact you directly, Ruby said quickly, like she needed to defend Brielle. She made me promise not to give her your address or phone number. She said she'd given up her rights to be your mother, and she didn't want to disrupt your life. But she never stopped caring. She has newspaper clippings of every art show you've ever been in. She knows about your college graduation, your internship acceptance, everything. The revelation that this stranger had been following my life from a distance while my parents actively hid her existence from me felt like a betrayal so deep I couldn't find words for it. How could you do this to me? How could you let me wonder about her for my entire life when she was right here?" "Because we love you," Mom said desperately. "Because you're our daughter, and we were terrified of losing you." "But I was never really yours, was I?" I said, the words coming out crueler than I intended. "You bought me from a desperate teenager, and when she got her life together, you decided to keep me from her anyway." "That's not fair," Dad said, his voice rough with emotion. "We raised you, we loved you, we were there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every triumph. We are your parents." "So is she," Ruby said quietly, and the simple statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything we'd all believed about family and ownership and love. I realized in that moment that my entire life had been shaped by fear. Mom and Dad's fear of losing me, Brielle's fear of disrupting my life, Ruby's fear of betraying everyone's secrets, and my own fear of asking the questions that might have led to these answers years ago. "I want to meet her," I said, the words coming out steady and sure despite the chaos in my heart. "I want to meet Brielle. Today." The silence that followed was different from all the others. This wasn't the silence of secrets or shame. This was the silence of a family finally facing the truth they'd all been running from for 22 years. Ruby called Brielle that afternoon, and within an hour I was sitting across from my biological mother in a small coffee shop downtown. She looked nothing like I'd imagined during all those years of wondering. She was petite, with kind eyes, and prematurely gray hair that she wore in a neat bun. Her hands shook slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup, and I could see the nervousness radiating from her entire body. "I never thought this day would come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've dreamed about it, but I never thought it would actually happen." The first thing she did was apologize. She told me about being 19 and terrified, about the abusive relationship she couldn't escape, about the drugs she used to numb the pain of her circumstances. She explained how meeting Coral and Finn had felt like a miracle, how she'd known immediately that they could give me everything she couldn't. "I want you to know that giving you to them wasn't about the money," she said, tears streaming down her face. "The money helped me get clean and start over, but I would have done it for free if it meant you'd have a safe, loving home." What surprised me most was how much she knew about my life. She pulled out a small photo album filled with pictures Ruby had secretly taken over the years. My high school graduation, my first art show, candid shots of me at family gatherings. She'd been watching me grow up from a distance, celebrating my victories and worrying about my struggles without ever being able to be part of them. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become," she said, looking through the photos. "Coral and Finn did everything right. They gave you opportunities I never could have provided, and they loved you exactly the way you deserved to be loved." The conversation lasted 4 hours. We talked about everything from my childhood memories to her recovery journey to our shared love of books and art. I learned that she'd gotten her GED while in rehab, that she'd worked her way up from shelving books to managing the children's programs at the library, that she'd never married or had other children because she couldn't imagine loving anyone the way she'd loved me. When I got home that evening, Mom and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me. They looked like they'd aged 10 years in the span of one day, and I could see the fear in their eyes as I walked through the door. "How did it go?" Mom asked carefully. "She's not trying to take me away from you," I said, sitting down across from them. "She never was. She just wanted to know that I was okay." The relief on their faces was immediate and profound. Dad reached across the table and took my hand. "We're sorry, Sage. We're so sorry we didn't tell you the truth sooner. We were just so scared of losing you." Over the following weeks, we slowly built a new kind of family dynamic. Brielle started joining us for some of our Sunday dinners at Ruby's house, and the initial awkwardness gradually gave way to genuine friendship. Mom and Brielle bonded over their shared love for me, and I watched in amazement as they developed their own relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. I still took the internship in New York, but now I had 2 mothers cheering me on instead of one. Brielle and I started a small side business together, creating custom book covers and promotional materials for local authors. Mom continued to be my biggest supporter, and Dad remained the steady, reliable presence he'd always been. The experience taught me that family isn't just about biology or legal documents or even the circumstances that bring people together. It's about the choice to love someone consistently, day after day, year after year. Coral and Finn chose to love me when I was a baby they barely knew. Brielle chose to love me enough to give me up when she couldn't provide what I needed. Ruby chose to love me enough to keep everyone's secrets while still maintaining a connection to my birth mother. I learned that truth, even when it's complicated and painful, is always better than living with lies. Those 22 years of secrets had created unnecessary pain for everyone involved. If my parents had been honest from the beginning, if Brielle had reached out when she got clean, if Ruby had spoken up sooner, we all could have avoided years of fear and uncertainty. Most importantly, I learned that love multiplies rather than divides. Having a relationship with Brielle didn't diminish my love for Mom and Dad. It expanded it, creating space for more connection, more understanding, and more appreciation for all the people who had shaped my life. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below about your own family experiences, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories about love, family, and the complicated truths that make us who we are.